Black kids do not win debate finals at this level, Professor Graham Whitmore said, almost under his breath, while Malik Carter stood beneath the stage lights with 3 handwritten pages in his left hand. He said it at the judges' table inside Emerson Hall, a stone and glass auditorium at the heart of Waverly University, where 600 students, professors, donors, journalists, and scholarship sponsors had come to watch the National Constitutional Debate Final. The lights above the stage were cold and white. The floor had been polished until it reflected every shoe that crossed it. A brass university seal glowed behind the podium, and on the screen above it were the words National Constitutional Debate Final. Malik heard the sentence. So did the nearest judge. So did a student technician wearing a headset behind the soundboard. And somewhere above the table, a small red recording light stayed on. Malik wore a plain charcoal suit he had bought on sale 3 years earlier, repaired dress shoes, and the dark blue tie his mother had given him before his first law school interview. In his pocket was her old library card, laminated at the corners, with her name still printed in faded black ink. Denise Carter, public school librarian. He placed his notes on the podium. He did not shout. He did not step away. He did not give Professor Whitmore the anger the man was waiting to punish. He only looked toward the judges' table and said, "I am ready to begin." Whitmore smiled as if he had already decided the ending. He thought Malik was only a gifted young scholar from a public school background, a debate finalist who should feel honored to stand in the same room as Ivy League champions. He did not know Malik Carter had already worked inside federal chambers, drafting legal memoranda for a United States federal judge. He did not know Malik had spent months reviewing records, identifying procedural errors, and learning how bias hides inside polite language. And within 30 minutes, the same judge who mocked him would be standing before Dean Eleanor Shaw, a federal judge, on video, 2 score sheets, 1 audio file, and an auditorium full of people who had finally heard the truth that was not supposed to be recorded. But at 9:16 that morning, Professor Graham Whitmore still believed he controlled the room. That was his first mistake. Emerson Hall had been built to impress people before anyone spoke. The ceiling rose in pale arches above the auditorium. Portraits of former university presidents lined the side walls, their faces stern and distant, as if generations of authority had been framed to watch every student who dared stand under the lights. Rows of dark wooden seats curved toward the stage. The first 3 rows were reserved for faculty, donors, and invited press from academic journals. At the center of the stage stood 2 podiums. One had a small placard that read Carter, the other read Pierce. Malik Carter entered from the left aisle at 9:08, carrying a slim folder and a worn leather notebook. He was 29, tall, quiet, and composed in the way people become composed when they have spent their whole lives in rooms where one wrong tone can be used against them. His face did not show nerves, though nerves were there. His right thumb brushed the edge of the old library card in his pocket. Ava Brooks walked beside him with a tablet held to her chest. She was 21, a research fellow from the same scholarship program Malik had once mentored. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes moved quickly. She had already found too many small irregularities to believe this final was clean. Malik had been moved to speak first, even though the original schedule placed him second. One appendix to the final rule packet had not been sent to his team. The updated rebuttal timing sheet had arrived in the inbox of every Ivy League team at 7:31 the previous evening, but not in the folder assigned to Malik. Ava had checked the message headers twice. This did not look like an accident. She leaned closer as they reached the stage steps. Malik, the order change was entered from the competition office account at 6:12 this morning. No explanation, no signature. Malik nodded. Keep the screenshots, already saved. The rule appendix, still missing from our packet, but I got a copy from the public archive. Good. She looked at him. This is not normal. He looked toward the judges' table, where Professor Whitmore sat in the center chair, straight-backed, silver-haired, and smooth as polished stone. No, Malik said, but it is familiar. Ava wanted to ask what that meant, but the auditorium lights dimmed before she could. At the judges' table, Professor Graham Whitmore adjusted his cuff and looked at the name card. Malik Carter. He had reviewed the finalist biographies the night before. He had read Malik credentials with growing irritation. Public high school, regional debate scholarship, community legal advocacy fellow, law degree with high honors, current federal law clerk. That last line had been in the longer packet, but not in the short program given to the audience. Whitmore had skimmed it and dismissed it. The term clerk, to him, sounded administrative when attached to someone who did not come from the right institutions. He assumed the biography was being inflated for a diversity narrative. Whitmore had built his reputation inside elite debate and constitutional theory circles. He had studied at Waverly, coached Waverly, judged national finals, and written a book called The Architecture of Persuasion. He was praised for his standards. He used that word often. Standards. He said it when students from smaller schools beat favored teams. He said it when a speaker with a regional accent sounded too direct. He said it when personal history entered legal argument. He said it when a black student won a room before he was ready to admit the argument had won it. Standards. The word did much of his hiding for him. Beside him sat Judge Elena Park, a retired state appellate judge who had been invited as neutral chair. On Whitmore's other side sat Professor Henry Lawson, who had once coached Julian Pierce, the Ivy League finalist standing at the opposite podium. Whitmore knew Julian well. Julian Pierce had the kind of resume Waverly liked: private academy, legacy family, undergraduate honors, debate institute training since age 14. A father who donated to university speech programs. A voice smooth enough to make uncertain claims sound established. Julian was intelligent. That was true. But he had never had to prove he belonged before being allowed to argue. Malik had. That difference mattered before either man spoke. At 9:10, Dean Eleanor Shaw stepped to the microphone. She was the dean of academic programs and the public face of the final. Her gray suit was immaculate. Her smile was practiced. She understood the importance of the event. Donors funded scholarships based on mornings like this. Reporters wrote about access and excellence. Waverly liked to present itself as a place where talent rose from anywhere, as long as anywhere did not disturb the shape of the room. "Welcome to the National Constitutional Debate Final," Dean Shaw said. "Today finalists will address a question at the center of modern public governance. Should government institutions be required to disclose algorithmic decision-making when public rights are affected?" A screen behind her displayed the topic in large letters. Malik looked at it. He almost smiled. Of all possible topics, they had chosen due process, transparency, and the right to understand how power makes decisions. Ava glanced at him from the front row. She knew what he was thinking. The room itself had become part of the resolution. Dean Shaw continued. Each finalist will present an opening argument, respond to judge questions, offer a rebuttal, and submit to scoring under the published rubric. Our judges will evaluate legal reasoning, evidence, responsiveness, constitutional understanding, and professional polish. At the phrase professional polish, Malik's eyes moved to Whitmore. Whitmore was already watching him. Professional polish was one of those phrases that sounded neutral until someone used it to punish a voice that did not resemble their own. Malik had heard versions of it since he was 16. In a high school regional tournament, he had borrowed his uncle's shoes because his own had split near the sole. The shoes were half a size too large. He had put folded tissue at the toes so they would not slip. He won the argument on substance. One judge gave him a low presentation score and wrote, "Strong speaker, but lacks winner posture."
He had stared at the note for an hour. Winner posture. His mother found him sitting at the kitchen table that night, the comment sheet open beside a cold plate of rice and chicken. Denise Carter had worked as a public school librarian for 27 years. She knew what coded language looked like because school systems used it on children every day. Malik asked her, "What does winner posture mean?" She sat across from him. "It means they noticed everything except your argument." He was quiet. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a worn pocket copy of the United States Constitution, a book of civil rights speeches, and a library card with her name on it. "Then, learn the rules of their table better than the people guarding the chairs," she said. "If they say you lack polish, make your reasoning so clear that their word has to stand alone and reveal itself." Years later, after she died, Malik kept that library card. Not because it had value, because she did. At 9:14, the finalists were introduced. Julian Pierce received a warm wave of applause, especially from the Waverly section. He smiled, nodded, and stepped forward with easy grace. Then Dean Shaw said, "Representing the Carter Public Law Fellowship and the National Access Debate Initiative, Malik Carter." The applause was strong, but different. A pocket of public school students near the back stood up. A group of scholarship fellows clapped with both hands raised. Ava stood too. Whitmore did not clap. He leaned toward Professor Lawson, eyes still on Malik. And then he said it. Black kids do not win debate finals at this level. The table microphone was not intended to broadcast side comments, but the internal recording system used separate channels for the official archive. The red light above the judges' table remained on because the final had started when Dean Shaw introduced the competitors. A student technician named Noah Bell looked down at the soundboard. His headset crackled. He saw the channel spike. He heard the words through the monitor. His hand froze above the controls. For a second, he considered muting the feed. Then he did not. He had seen Malik check in that morning with Ava, polite and prepared. He had seen Whitmore ask the competition office whether the public fellowship finalist really needed equal rebuttal time. He had laughed it off as a scheduling concern then. Now he knew better. At the judges' table, Judge Elena Park looked sharply at Whitmore. "Graham," she whispered. Whitmore pretended not to hear. Malik had heard enough. The words reached him not as surprise, but as confirmation. They explained the missing packet, the changed order, the way Whitmore's eyes had measured him before the debate began. For 1 second, the room blurred. He saw his mother in the library after closing, sliding books into the correct shelves under flickering light. He saw children sitting cross-legged on the carpet while she taught them that a voice did not need permission to be powerful. He saw her writing a note on the inside cover of his first debate notebook. "Speak so clearly that unfairness has nowhere to hide." His throat tightened. He almost stepped back. Almost. Then he placed the old library card flat beneath his notes, where only he could see it. He stood straighter. Dean Shaw returned to her seat. Professor Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Carter, you may begin." Malik looked at the auditorium, then at the judges, then at the screen with the topic. "Transparency is not the enemy of effective government," he began. "Transparency is how power proves it is not afraid of being examined." The first sentence settled over the room. People stopped shifting. Malik continued.
"When a government institution uses an algorithm to decide who receives benefits, who is flagged for investigation, who is denied housing support, who is ranked as risky, or who is pushed out of an opportunity, the question is not whether technology is convenient. The question is whether a person affected by that decision has a meaningful chance to understand it, challenge it, and know whether the rule was applied fairly." A few pens moved. Judge Park leaned forward. Whitmore watched without expression. Malik moved through his first point with a calm rhythm. He explained due process as more than a courtroom phrase. It was the principle that when the state affects a person's liberty, property, or access to public rights, it cannot hide the reason inside a machine no one is allowed to question. He cited public benefit review systems. He cited risk assessment tools. He cited administrative decision-making.
He explained that trade secrecy could matter, but not as a wall so high that a citizen could never know why a public decision had harmed them. His voice did not tremble. The room followed him. That made Whitmore intervene. "Mr. Carter." Malik paused. "Yes, Professor? Do you have authority for that claim, or are we relying on moral preference?" A small sound moved through the room. Malik answered evenly. "I have authority, Professor. I am building toward the case law after defining the constitutional injury." Whitmore smiled thinly. "At this level, we prefer law before speeches." Malik nodded. "Then let us move directly to law." He turned one page. "When government action affects protected interests, procedural fairness requires notice and a meaningful opportunity to respond. The challenge with algorithmic decision-making is that notice becomes empty when the affected person cannot understand the basis of the decision." Judge Park wrote something down. Whitmore tapped his pen. "Proceed." Malik did. He cited the logic carefully, not as a list of cases thrown at the audience, but as a chain. A person cannot challenge what they cannot see. A system cannot be trusted simply because it is technical. A public institution cannot outsource accountability to a model and then claim the model is too complex to explain. At the back of the auditorium, several students leaned forward. Ava watched the timer. Whitmore watched the room. The more the room listened, the more impatient he became. "Mr. Carter," he interrupted again, "when Malik moved into disparate impact concerns, are you suggesting all government algorithms are discriminatory?" "No, Professor. I am saying that when algorithmic systems affect public rights, meaningful disclosure is necessary to detect whether discrimination exists." "That sounds speculative." "Only if the system is never examined." A few students murmured. Whitmore heard it. His jaw tightened. Malik continued before Whitmore could cut again.
A transparent process does not presume bad faith. It recognizes that hidden decision-making can produce harm, even when designers claim neutral intent.
The rule I propose is not full public exposure of every technical detail. It is a structured disclosure obligation when public rights are affected. The government must identify the decision factor, provide an explanation meaningful enough to challenge, preserve audit records, and allow independent review where secrecy is claimed. Judge Park looked up. "That is a narrower argument than your opponent brief suggested." Malik turned to her. "Yes, Judge Park, because accountability must be precise to be workable." That answer landed. Even Professor Lawson, who favored Julian, wrote a note. Whitmore saw it. He cut in again. "You seem very comfortable using courtroom language, Mr. Carter, but this is a debate final, not a legal memorandum." Malik looked at him. "The topic asks what constitutional governance requires."
Legal precision seems appropriate.
The silence after that was small but powerful. Ava lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Noah at the soundboard looked up from his controls. Julian Pierce watched from the other podium. For the first time, he understood that Malik was not simply passionate. He was trained. Every answer had a structure. Every phrase carried weight. Malik was doing more than performing argument. He was building a record. That made Julian uneasy, because Julian had seen the changed schedule too. He had received the updated rule appendix. He had not asked whether Malik had. The thought had passed through his mind that morning and kept going because the advantage helped him. Now, listening to Malik answer interruption after interruption, Julian felt that silence return and sit beside him. Malik reached his final line. "A government that uses unseen systems to affect public rights must not ask the citizen to trust what the citizen is forbidden to test." Disclosure is not a burden on legitimacy. It is the beginning of it.
For a moment, the hall did not move. Then applause rose. It began in the back rows with the public school students, then scholarship fellows, then professors, then more of the auditorium joined. Dean Shaw looked relieved. Whitmore did not. He pressed the microphone button. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We will evaluate both substance and polish." The word polish hung in the air like a warning. Malik gathered his pages. His hand brushed the library card. He did not sit immediately. He looked at Whitmore and said, "I welcome evaluation under the published rubric." Whitmore's smile returned. "As do we." But Ava Brooks, seated in the front row, had already opened a new document on her tablet. She titled it Competition Irregularities. Under it, she began writing. Opening statement. Malik interrupted 4 times. Julian interrupted 0 times so far. Missing appendix. Order changed. Microphone comment captured. She stopped for 1 second after typing the last line. Microphone comment captured. Then she looked at Noah Bell at the soundboard. Noah saw her. He gave one tiny nod. That was when Ava knew the words had not disappeared. Whitmore still thought the room belonged to him. But a record was forming in 3 places at once. In Ava Notes, in Noah audio file, and in Malik Calm. Julian Pierce stepped to his podium with a clean smile and a perfect tie, preparing to speak to a room that had always been ready to hear him. Malik sat down, placed the library card back in his pocket, and looked at the judges' table. The debate was not over. It had only revealed what else was being argued. Julian Pierce stepped to the opposite podium beneath the white stage lights with the confidence of a man who had never needed to wonder whether the room was built for him. His suit fit perfectly. His tie was deep red. His notes were printed on thick cream paper with neat tabs along the side. When he placed both hands on the podium, the motion looked natural, but it was the kind of natural that came from years of training in expensive rooms. Professor Graham Whitmore leaned back in his chair. For Julian, he did not tap his pen. For Julian, he did not interrupt before the first legal point was complete. For Julian, he smiled like a teacher watching the world stay in the order he preferred. Malik Carter sat at the side table with his worn notebook closed in front of him. His face was calm, but his thumb pressed once against the old library card in his pocket. Denise Carter, public school librarian. That card had outlived the library branch where she worked. It had outlived the debate classroom where Malik first learned to stand in front of strangers. It had outlived the illness that took his mother before she could see him become a federal law clerk. He carried it because every important room made him remember the first room that had believed in him. A public school library with peeling paint, uneven shelves, a heater that rattled in winter, a copy machine that jammed whenever students needed it most. That was where Malik learned to argue, not in marble halls, not at summer debate institutes with private coaches, not in classrooms named after donors. He learned beside broken printers, late buses, and students who whispered because they thought smart people were supposed to stay quiet in public. His mother stayed after closing to let him read case summaries she printed from old databases. She could not afford debate camp, so she built one from borrowed books and index cards. She gave him speeches, court opinions, logic chapters, and old news articles about children who had to fight school systems simply to be heard. When Malik was 14, he told her he wanted to sound like the students from famous schools. Denise shook her head. "Do not borrow their voice," she said. "Build yours so clearly that they have to deal with it." At 16, he went to a regional debate final wearing his uncle's shoes because his own soles had split near the toe. The shoes were too large, so he stuffed tissue paper inside them. During cross-examination, one opponent looked down and smiled at the shoes before answering his question. Malik won the argument. He lost the round. The comment sheet said, "Strong content,
but not the posture of a winner. That night, he brought the sheet home folded inside his jacket. His mother read it at the kitchen table beside a cold plate of rice and chicken. "Posture of a winner," she said softly. "That means they saw your shoes before they heard your mind." Malik was angry. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Denise placed the comment sheet beside a pocket constitution. "You learn the rules so well that when they bend them, you can name the bend." That sentence followed him into every classroom, every tournament, every scholarship interview, and eventually into federal chambers. Years later, when Judge Rebecca Monroe selected Malik for a federal clerkship, she gave him a file with thousands of pages of record and said, "Do not tell me what sounds fair. Tell me what the record supports." That became his training. Every word needed a source. Every conclusion needed a reason. Every reason needed to survive review. Inside chambers, Malik learned that power was most dangerous when it looked orderly but could not explain itself. A missing page could change a case. A vague standard could bury a claim. A decision-maker could hide bias behind a polished word if no one demanded the record. So when Ava Brooks told him the rule appendix was missing, he did not call it small. When the speaking order changed without a signed explanation, he did not call it confusion. When Whitmore interrupted his first argument before the structure was complete, he did not call it style. He called it what it was, a record forming. On stage, Julian began.
Government transparency is important, he said, but public institutions must be able to use modern tools without being trapped by endless disclosure demands. His tone was smooth. His language was elegant. He spoke about institutional efficiency, administrative capacity, expert judgment, national competitiveness, and the danger of slowing public agencies with excessive review. He sounded like someone who had read many papers about people affected by public systems, but had never sat beside a family trying to appeal a decision they could not understand. Malik listened carefully. Julian was not weak. That mattered. A weak opponent would have made the final simple. Julian was intelligent, trained, and quick. He knew how to make limited transparency sound practical and full disclosure sound childish. But his argument had an empty place inside it. He trusted institutions easily because institutions had always returned his trust. Whitmore did not interrupt. When Julian said automated tools should be presumed lawful unless clear harm was proven, Whitmore nodded. When Julian called disclosure demands a form of emotional pressure from advocacy groups, Whitmore wrote approvingly. When Julian skipped the question of how a poor person could prove harm without knowing the reason for a public decision, Whitmore let him pass. Ava Brooks wrote everything down. Julian interruption count, 0. Whitmore favorable nods, 5. Unsupported claims not challenged, 3. She glanced toward Noah Bell at the soundboard. Noah had one hand near the controls, but his eyes were on the stage. He looked nervous now. Not confused. Nervous in the way a person becomes when they know they hold evidence that can damage someone powerful. Ava knew that feeling. She had felt it all morning. Ava had met Malik 2 years earlier through the Carter Public Law Fellowship, a program that placed students from underfunded schools into summer legal research projects. She nearly quit after a professor told her that her writing sounded too personal for legal analysis. Malik read her draft and said, "Your experience is not the problem. The problem is that you have not connected it to doctrine yet. Do not erase yourself. Build the bridge." That sentence kept her in the program. Now she was watching the same kind of room try to erase him. Julian finished to warm applause from the Waverly section. Whitmore leaned toward the microphone. "Excellent framing, Mr. Pierce." Judge Elena Park looked at him from the side of the table. Malik noticed. So did Ava. Whitmore asked Julian only one question.
How would you stop disclosure rules from becoming weapons against agencies trying to serve the public? Julian smiled. By trusting courts to intervene when concrete injury is shown, while avoiding broad mandates based on fear. Whitmore nodded. Very good. Malik wrote 2 words in his notebook: concrete injury. He underlined them once. The unfairness was clear now, but he knew better than to chase it too early. If he accused Whitmore before the record was complete, the accusation would become the story. His tone would be examined, his timing would be criticized, his motive would be questioned. That was how institutions protected themselves. They waited for the injured person to become loud, then made loudness the issue. Denise Carter had taught him that too. Once, when Malik was in high school, she took him to a school board meeting after the district cut library hours. Parents spoke for 2 hours. Teachers brought data. Students described losing access to computers after school. The board listened politely and voted anyway. On the bus ride home, Malik said they had already decided. His mother nodded. Then why did everyone speak? Because the record matters, she said. Sometimes the first hearing is not where justice happens. Sometimes it is where justice gets the evidence it will need later. Now Malik sat inside Emerson Hall and let Whitmore continue, because the record mattered. After opening arguments, Dean Eleanor Shaw announced a 15-minute preparation break before cross questions. The auditorium lights rose halfway. Donors stood. Students whispered. Journalists typed notes. For a moment, the room pretended the tension had softened. It had not. Ava moved quickly to Malik's side and placed the tablet flat in front of him. Look. She had organized the irregularities by time. 6:12 in the morning. Speaking order changed. No signed acknowledgement. 7:31 the previous evening. Updated rebuttal timing sheet sent to Waverly and invited school team folders. Not sent to Carter Public Law Fellowship folder. 8:52. Judge table microphones activated for archival recording. 9:14. Whitmore comment captured on Channel 3. 9:21 through 9:37. Malik interrupted 4 times. Julian interrupted 0 times. Malik looked at the screen. Do we have the audio? Noah has it, Ava said. He has not sent it yet. He should be careful. He should also not bury it. Malik looked toward the sound booth. Noah avoided his eyes at first, then looked back. Malik gave him a small nod. Not pressure, recognition. Ava lowered her voice. This is worse than I thought. Malik said, It usually is. You heard the comment. Yes. How are you this calm? Malik looked toward Whitmore, who was speaking with a donor near the judge's table. Because he needs me not to be. Ava did not answer. Malik continued. If I get angry now, he will call it proof. If I wait, he has to answer the process. Ava's eyes glistened. Your mother would be furious. Malik smiled faintly. My mother was often furious. She just knew how to shelve it until it had a catalog number. Ava laughed once, quietly, because she needed to. Across the room, Dean Shaw watched them with a fixed smile. She had not heard Whitmore first comment clearly, but she had seen Judge Park's reaction. She had seen the uneven interruptions. She knew the final was beginning to feel unbalanced. Still, her first instinct was not justice. It was containment. Waverly University had spent years building the National Constitutional Debate Final into a showpiece. Donors liked it because it made access look elegant. Faculty liked it because it made prestige look generous. Dean Shaw liked it because every brochure could show students from public programs standing under Ivy League lights. But a public scandal would ask harder questions. Who controls the rules? Who trains the judges? Who reviews scoring? Who gets protected when bias sounds like expertise? Dean Shaw feared those questions. That fear made her dangerous before it made her honest. She approached Malik and Ava. Mr. Carter, strong opening. Thank you, Dean Shaw. I understand there were concerns about scheduling. We can address administrative matters after the final. Malik looked at her. Dean, the order change and missing appendix affect the final. Her smile tightened. I would hate for process concerns to distract from your performance. Ava said, Process is part of the performance when the topic is public decision-making. Dean Shaw looked at her. And you are? Ava Brooks, research lead for Mr. Carter team. I see. The words sounded polite. They were not. Malik spoke before Ava could answer sharply. Dean Shaw, we are preserving the issue. We will continue under protest if needed. Under protest sounds rather formal. Formal language is useful when informal fairness has failed. Dean Shaw looked at him more carefully then. For the first time, she saw not just a competitor, but someone trained to create a record. She lowered her voice. This is not a court, Mr. Carter. No, but it is a competition that promised rules. That ended the conversation for the moment. At the judges' table, Whitmore leaned toward Professor Lawson. He is trying to turn this into procedure now. Lawson murmured, he is good. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. He is coached. Judge Park, who had heard enough, said, or prepared. Whitmore looked at her. There is a difference. Yes, Judge Park said, and I think you may be confusing it. He did not respond. At 10:02, the cross-question round began. Whitmore opened immediately. Mr. Carter, you propose structured disclosure when public rights are affected. Define public rights without turning every agency decision into a constitutional hearing. Malik stepped forward. Public rights in my framework refer to government decisions that materially affect liberty, statutory benefits, eligibility for public services, housing access, education access, or legal status. The disclosure duty would be scaled, not absolute. Whitmore interrupted. Scaled by whom? By statute, agency rule, and judicial review when needed. So you trust agencies to design the disclosure that limits them. I trust agencies to begin the process, courts to review the process, and affected people to challenge failures when the explanation is not meaningful. Whitmore leaned in. That sounds idealistic. Malik answered, no more idealistic than trusting hidden systems because they are efficient. A murmur moved through the audience. Whitmore tapped his pen. You are avoiding the cost. I am weighing cost against constitutional injury. You keep using that phrase. Because it is the center of the topic. Judge Park wrote again. Professor Lawson asked Julian a question next, but it was open and generous. Julian answered at length. When he drifted away from the question, Whitmore did not interrupt. When he spoke past the time light, no one stopped him. Ava wrote, Julian exceeds answer time by 47 seconds. No interruption. She glanced toward the timekeeper, who looked uncomfortable but did not act. The pattern was no longer hidden. It was only unaddressed. Malik saw Julian's face as he returned to his podium. Julian knew it too. His eyes moved once toward the timer, then toward Malik. Something like shame crossed his expression. Then he looked away. That was the silence he would have to answer for later. Near the soundboard, Noah Bell copied the archived audio channel to a secure university drive. His hands shook as he named the file. Final Audio Channel 3 Judges Table. He hesitated before saving. He thought about Whitmore's reputation. He thought about Dean Shaw. He thought about his campus job. He thought about how easy it would be to say he had never noticed the comment. Then he looked at Malik, standing under the lights, answering another interruption with a calm that felt heavier than anger. Noah pressed save. That was one person choosing not to look away. At 10:18, Whitmore interrupted Malik again. Mr. Carter, your argument is beginning to sound less like constitutional analysis and more like distrust of institutions. Malik placed both hands on the podium. A constitutional system is not weakened when people ask institutions to explain themselves. It is weakened when institutions treat the request for explanation as disrespect. The audience went silent. Whitmore realized too late that the sentence applied to the debate as much as the topic. He smiled coldly. Careful, Mr. Carter. Debate finalists are evaluated on responsiveness, not slogans. Malik looked at him. Then I will be precise. Affected people need notice, meaningful reasons, a chance to challenge error, and independent review when secrecy is claimed. That is not a slogan, that is a procedural structure. Judge Park said, "That answers the question." Whitmore pen stopped. Julian watched. Ava wrote. Judge Park intervention. Dean Shaw sat in the front row, no longer smiling. She could feel the final slipping away from ceremony and toward scrutiny. She did not yet know whether she would protect the ceremony or the truth, but the choice was coming. At 10:27, the cross-question round ended. Malik returned to his seat. The first wave of exhaustion hit him as soon as he sat. His mouth was dry. His shoulders ached from holding still. He wanted one moment away from the lights, away from Whitmore eyes, away from the constant need to make every breath unweaponizable. Ava leaned over. "Are you all right?" Malik nodded, but his hand went to the library card. For a few seconds, the auditorium blurred. He saw his mother, library after closing, chairs upside down on tables, floor wax in the air, her hands stamping due dates. Her voice telling him children were not poor in voice, only in rooms willing to listen. He whispered, "I am still here, Mom." Ava heard him. She did not speak. Some grief deserves privacy, even in public. Then the timekeeper announced the final rebuttal round would begin in 5 minutes. Whitmore looked down at his score sheet. The categories were broad enough to hide almost anything: credibility, professional polish, responsiveness, institutional understanding, legal reasoning, evidence use. He could not destroy Malik on legal reasoning without looking foolish. He could not deny the evidence completely. But polish, responsiveness, institutional understanding, those were soft places. That was where men like Whitmore did their work. He marked a number in the margin, then lowered it again. At the other podium, Julian looked at his own notes, but his focus was gone. He had come to win a debate. He was beginning to understand that winning and deserving could become enemies if no one checked the scorekeeper. Ava turned her tablet toward Malik. Final rebuttal in 5. "We have enough." "Not yet," Malik said. Ava stared at him. "What else do you need?" Malik looked at the screen showing the topic one more time. "I need him to reveal the standard he is using." Ava followed his gaze to Whitmore. "And if he does, then we ask for the record." The stage lights brightened. Dean Shaw returned to the microphone. "We will now proceed to final rebuttals." Malik stood. His legs felt heavy. His throat still held the words Whitmore had said before the first argument began. "Black kids do not win debate finals at this level." The sentence had been designed to shrink him before he spoke. But Denise Carter had spent her life putting books into the hands of children the world tried to shrink. Malik walked to the podium. He placed 3 handwritten pages on the wood. Then he placed the old library card beneath them. Not for luck, for witness. He looked at Ava, at Noah near the soundboard, at Julian, at Dean Shaw, at Whitmore. Then he began. "When power controls the criteria, the record, and the explanation, the person affected by the decision does not need charity, he needs process." Whitmore lifted his pen. This time, Malik did not look away. And Professor Graham Whitmore, not realizing the trap was now made of his own interruptions, prepared to cut him off one time too many. Malik stood at the podium with 3 handwritten pages in front of him and his mother's old library card hidden beneath them. The stage lights made the paper look almost white. His throat was dry. His shoulders ached. His legs still felt heavy from holding himself steady through every interruption, every polished insult, every moment where Whitmore tried to make calm sound like defiance. But Malik did not look tired. That was discipline, not comfort. He looked once at Ava Brooks in the front row. She had her tablet ready, every irregularity already arranged by time, source, and effect. He looked once toward Noah Bell at the soundboard.
Noah had copied the judge's table audio into a secure archive and now sat with both hands near his keyboard, pale but still watching. Then Malik looked at Julian Pierce. Julian did not smile this time.
He had come into Emerson Hall expecting a hard debate and a clean victory. He had not expected to watch a judge tilt the room in his favor so openly that the advantage began to feel like a stain. Dean Eleanor Shaw stepped away from the center microphone. "Mr. Carter, you may begin your final rebuttal." Malik nodded. When power controls the criteria, the record, and the explanation, the person affected by the decision does not need charity. He needs process. The first sentence landed in the auditorium with a force that made even the donors stop shifting in their seats. Malik continued. "My opponent asks this room to trust public institutions first and examine them later. But delayed accountability is often no accountability at all. When a person is denied housing support because of an automated score, when a family loses public benefits because a system flags inconsistency, when a student is ranked out of opportunity by a model no one can explain, the harm does not wait for perfect litigation. It arrives at the mailbox. It arrives at the school office. It arrives at the agency window, where someone says, 'The system decided.'" He paused. A room that heard legal argument as human consequence leaned closer. That worried Whitmore. "Mr. Carter," he said, "are we now debating poverty policy or constitutional disclosure?" Malik turned toward him. "We are debating whether constitutional disclosure matters when public systems affect real people. The categories cannot be separated simply because one makes the other uncomfortable." A low murmur moved through the back rows. Whitmore tapped his pen. "Please stay within the topic." Malik looked at the screen behind him. "The topic asks whether government institutions should be required to disclose algorithmic decision-making when public rights are affected." "I am exactly within the topic." Judge Elena Park looked down to hide the smallest movement of approval. Ava wrote. Interruption 10. No basis. Malik returned to the auditorium. A disclosure rule does not require government to publish every line of code. It requires enough meaningful information for a person to know three things: what factor affected the decision, what rule was applied, what path exists to challenge error. He lifted one page. That is not anti-institution. That is how an institution proves it has earned trust. Whitmore leaned into his microphone again. "And who decides what is meaningful?" Malik answered without hesitation. "The standard begins with the affected person's ability to understand the basis of the decision, then moves through agency rule, administrative review, and judicial review when secrecy is asserted."
Meaningful does not mean unlimited. It means enough to make challenge possible. Whitmore said, "That sounds like a litigation machine." Malik said, "Hidden error is already a litigation machine. It simply bills the poor first." The room went silent. Then someone in the back whispered, "That was good." Whitmore heard it. His face tightened. "Professional polish," he said quietly. But the table microphone was close enough for Judge Park to hear. Malik heard the phrase too. This time, he did not let it pass. "Professor," he said, "would you like me to answer a question about polish or a question about law?" The auditorium froze. Whitmore sat back. "I am reminding you that style matters." Malik nodded. "Then please identify where my legal structure lacks clarity." Whitmore did not answer at once. That delay mattered, because the problem was not clarity. The problem was that Malik had made the room understand. Professor Lawson shifted beside him. Judge Park wrote something on her score sheet.
Dean Shaw's hands tightened in her lap. Whitmore finally said, "Continue." Malik did. The rebuttal became sharper, not louder. He took Julian argument point by point. He accepted that agencies needed workable rules. He accepted that trade secrets could be protected. He accepted that not every technical detail belonged in a public file. Then he drew the line.
But when public power affects public rights, secrecy cannot become a locked door with a government seal on it. Efficiency cannot mean the citizen receives only a conclusion. Expertise cannot mean the expert never has to explain. A system that says "trust us" while refusing review is not modern governance. It is old power wearing new software. Applause rose before the moderator could stop it. Dean Shaw lifted one hand for quiet. Whitmore looked at the audience as if they had violated the room by reacting. Malik reached the final part. If we require explanations from human decision-makers, we should not accept less because the decision-maker is now a model, a score, or a hidden process. The Constitution is not allergic to technology, but neither is it impressed by it. Public rights require public reasons. He looked at the judges' table. And a fair system should never fear the record. The room stayed silent for a full second. Then applause came harder than before. Ava did not clap right away. She wrote the final line. A fair system should never fear the record. Then she looked at Noah. Noah nodded again, this time with more certainty. Julian stepped up for his final rebuttal after the applause faded. He was composed, but not as composed as before. His opening was strong. He warned against turning every algorithmic tool into a constitutional battlefield. He argued that public agencies needed flexibility, that technical transparency could expose security risks, and that courts should avoid demanding explanations beyond what agencies could reasonably provide. It was not a poor argument, but it was thinner than Malick's argument, and the room knew it. Then Julian made a claim that a limited explanation after the fact would satisfy most due process concerns. It was too broad. It needed support. Any judge listening fairly would ask for the source. Whitmore did not. He nodded. Excellent point. Ava wrote. Julian unsupported due process claim. No challenge. Julian continued past the timelight by 30 seconds. Then 40. Then 52. The timekeeper looked toward Whitmore. Whitmore gave the smallest shake of his head. Do not stop him, Ava wrote. Time exceeded. No penalty announced. Julian noticed the light. He saw the timekeeper. He saw Whitmore let him continue. His voice faltered for the first time. Then he finished. The applause for Julian was respectful, but smaller than the first time. That should have been enough for the room to understand. It was not enough for the score sheets. The judges withdrew to the side table at 10:42. Dean Shaw announced a short scoring interval. The audience began whispering in clusters. Journalists compared notes. Students from the public fellowship section looked angry but uncertain. Waverly students looked tense, as if they could feel a door closing on the clean story they had expected. Ava came to Malik. You won that. Malik kept his eyes on the judges. We do not know what they will write. Everyone knows. Everyone is not the score sheet. She looked at him, frustrated. That is exactly the problem. Yes. His calm made her angrier and steadier at the same time. At the soundboard, Noah opened the audio file again with headphones on. He played the judges' table channel from the beginning of the final. The words came through clearly enough to make his stomach turn. Black kids do not win debate finals at this level. He stopped the file, saved a backup, then another. His cursor hovered over an email to Dean Shaw. He did not send it yet. He knew that once he did, he would be part of the story. His name would be attached to the evidence. Whitmore would know. The university would know. He might lose his job at the event office. He might be told he misunderstood. He might be blamed for releasing internal audio. He looked at Malick on stage, then at the words on the screen. National Constitutional Debate Final. Constitutional. It sounded noble until someone had to act on it. Noah attached the audio file to a draft, then waited. At the judges' table, Whitmore completed his score sheet with the cold confidence of a man who had done this before. Legal reasoning. He could not go too low. Evidence use. He kept it respectable. But credibility. Lower. Professional polish. Lower. Responsiveness.
Lower. Institutional understanding. Much lower. He wrote a comment in the margin. Strong passion, but argument relies too heavily on distrust of institutions and lacks national final composure. Judge Park submitted her scores with Malik ahead by a wide margin. Professor Lawson scored Julian slightly higher on presentation, but Malik higher on legal analysis. His final totals were close, but honest enough to make the contest competitive. Whitmore's score changed everything. At 10:57, Dean Shaw received the scoring envelope from the tabulation director. She opened it, read the final result, and went still. The margin was small, too small. She looked toward the individual score sheets, then at Whitmore. He held her gaze. For a moment, Dean Shaw understood that something inside the numbers did not match what had happened on stage. Then her old instinct returned. Protect the event, announce the result, handle concerns later. She stepped to the microphone.
Thank you to both finalists for an extraordinary round. After tabulation, the winner of the National Constitutional Debate Final is Julian Pierce of Waverly University. The Waverly section erupted, but the applause was uneven. The public fellowship students did not stand. Ava closed her eyes. Malik did not move. Julian looked stunned, then relieved, then uncertain. A staff member approached him with the trophy, a silver cup on a black base. Julian took it automatically, but his eyes moved to Malik before he looked at the audience. Whitmore clapped with calm satisfaction. That was when Malik stood. Not quickly, not dramatically. He rose like someone answering a call in court. Dean Shaw saw him. Mr. Carter. Malik walked to the center microphone. With respect, Dean Shaw, I request review under the published competition rules. The room went quiet. Whitmore leaned back. Mr. Carter, he said, the final result has been announced. Malik turned to him. A result can be announced before it is explained. Some students murmured. Dean Shaw stepped closer. We can discuss any concerns privately after the ceremony. Malik looked at her. The scoring was public. The result was public. The irregularities affected a public final. The review process should begin on the record. Whitmore smiled without warmth. This is disappointing. I had hoped you would accept defeat with grace. Malik looked at him. I accept defeat when the process is fair. I do not accept a result that cannot survive its own rules. Julian still held the trophy. His fingers tightened around the base. Ava stood from the front row. Dean Shaw, the Carter team is preserving objections related to order change, missing rule appendix, unequal interruptions, timing irregularities, and scoring deviation. Whitmore said, She is not a competitor. Malik answered, She is my research lead. Whitmore said, This is not a court. Malik looked at him. Then why did it promise a record? Everything froze.
Dean Shaw knew the audience had heard that line. She moved into damage control. Mr. Carter, we respect your advocacy, but we cannot turn a ceremony into a procedural hearing. Malik nodded once. Then please identify where the published rules require a review request to wait until after the ceremony. Dean Shaw did not answer. Ava raised her tablet. Section 12 permits immediate review when a scoring irregularity, procedural denial, conflict issue, or material rule deviation may affect the outcome. Whitmore turned sharply. How did you get that appendix? Ava stared at him. It was missing from our packet, so I found the public archive. The audience reacted. Missing from our packet? Dean Shaw's face changed. Malik continued. We request the individual score sheets, timing logs, final rule packet distribution record, and any audio recording required for the official archive. Whitmore's voice hardened. Audio recording. From the soundboard, Noah Bell felt every eye pull toward him before anyone actually looked. Malik did not look at Noah. Not yet. He gave him space to choose. Whitmore said, "This is absurd. The score is final." Judge Park spoke before Dean Shaw could. Under Section 12, it is not final if a timely procedural review is requested before certification. Whitmore turned. Elena. Judge Park looked at him. Do not Elena me in the record. The auditorium went dead silent. That was when people understood this was no longer a disappointed finalist asking for mercy. A judge on the panel had just confirmed the rule. Dean Shaw slowly turned to the tabulation director. Has the result been certified? The director swallowed. No, Dean. The announcement was made, but certification sheet has not been signed. Ava whispered, good. Malik heard her. Julian looked down at the trophy in his hands as if it had become heavier. Whitmore said, we are not entertaining an appeal based on hurt feelings. Malik turned back to him. No one has mentioned feelings except you. A low sound moved through the hall. Whitmore face flushed. Malik continued. We are asking for the rule packet, the time log, the score sheets, the interruption record, and the archive audio. The last words made Noah look up. Archive audio. Dean Shaw looked toward the sound booth. Noah. He stood slowly. His headset hung around his neck. His hands trembled, but he did not hide them. Dean Shaw asked, is there archive audio from the judges' table? Noah swallowed. Yes. Whitmore said, side comments are not part of the debate record. Noah looked at him. The judges' table channel was live for archival recording beginning at 8:52. Dean Shaw's face went pale. Do you have the file? Noah looked at Malik, then at Ava, then at the audience. Yes, he said. I saved it. Whitmore stood. You had no authority to. Judge Park cut him off. Sit down, Graham. He did not sit. For the first time all morning, Whitmore looked less like a judge and more like a man afraid of the record he had made. Dean Shaw turned to Noah, her voice careful. Bring the file to the review table. Noah stepped away from the soundboard with a laptop in both hands. The auditorium watched him walk down the side aisle. Every step sounded louder than it should have. Julian slowly placed the trophy on the table beside his podium. Not returned yet, but no longer held. Malik saw it. So did Ava. So did Whitmore. At the review table, Dean Shaw opened the competition binder with hands that were no longer steady. Judge Park moved beside her. Professor Lawson followed with visible discomfort. Whitmore remained standing behind his chair, furious and trapped. Dean Shaw looked at Malik. Mr. Carter, state your review request for the record. Malik stepped to the microphone. I request review of material procedural irregularities affecting the final result, including unequal access to rule materials, unauthorized order change, unequal judge interruption, timing deviation, unexplained scoring variance, and any recorded statement bearing on bias or conflict. His voice was calm, not triumphant, calm, the kind of calm that made every word harder to dismiss. Dean Shaw looked at Noah. Play the relevant archive segment. Noah opened the file. The red progress bar moved across the screen. For one last second, the room was silent enough to hear the lights hum above the stage. Then the judges' table audio began to play. First came Dean Shaw introduction, then applause, then Whitmore voice, low but clear enough. Black kids do not win debate finals at this level. The auditorium stopped breathing. Whitmore's face turned white. Dean Shaw closed her eyes. Ava gripped the edge of her tablet. Julian looked at Malik with horror, not at what Malik had done, but at what Malik had been forced to endure while still out-arguing the room. Malik stood still. He had already heard the sentence once. The second time, it did not cut less. It only cut publicly. Then the audio continued another few seconds. Professor Lawson whispering, "Graham." Judge Park chair moving sharply. Whitmore pretending nothing had happened. Noah stopped the file. Nobody spoke. Then Malik turned toward Whitmore. "Professor," he said, "under what competition standard was that comment relevant to my score?" Whitmore opened his mouth. No answer came, and for the first time in the National Constitutional Debate Final, the man holding the score sheet was the one who had no argument. For the first time in the National Constitutional Debate Final, the man holding the score sheet was the one who had no argument. Professor Graham Whitmore stood behind the judges' table, pale under the white lights, staring at Noah Bell's laptop as if the sound file itself had betrayed him. But the file had not betrayed him. It had repeated him. Black kids do not win debate finals at this level. The sentence still hung in Emerson Hall, larger now than the brass university seal, larger than the banners, larger than the trophy sitting untouched beside Julian Pierce's podium. 600 people had heard it. Students, professors, donors, reporters, scholarship sponsors. The room that had been built to celebrate merit had just heard a judge declare the outcome before the argument had begun. Dean Eleanor Shaw did not speak at first. Her face had gone still in the way powerful people become still when they realize the safest path is gone. For years, she had handled controversy by moving it into offices, committees, private reviews, and careful language. This could not be moved quietly. Not anymore. Judge Elena Park placed both hands on the review table and looked at Dean Shaw. The review must proceed on the record. Whitmore snapped. That audio was not meant for public playback. Malik Carter turned toward him. Neither was the bias. But here we are. A sound moved through the hall. Not laughter, recognition. Whitmore pointed toward Noah. That student violated internal protocol. Noah stiffened. Malik answered before Noah could speak. The archive system was active under the competition rules. The question is not why the words were preserved. The question is why a judge said them. Whitmore's face tightened. "You are grandstanding." Malik looked at Dean Shaw. "Dean, I request that Professor Whitmore be separated from the review process because the recording creates a direct bias issue." Whitmore laughed once. "Separated. Listen to him. He thinks this is a courtroom." Malik did not raise his voice. "No, Professor. I think this is a public competition with written rules, archived audio, a scoring dispute, and a judge whose recorded statement goes directly to partiality. That is enough." Dean Shaw stared at him. Enough for what? Enough to require recusal from the review. The word recusal moved through the auditorium. Some students whispered it. Reporters wrote it down. Whitmore leaned forward. "You are not counsel here." Malik reached into his folder and removed a single sheet from the competition registration packet. "No, I am a competitor. But the biography your office verified lists me accurately." Dean Shaw took the page. Her eyes moved down. Malik Carter, Carter Public Law Fellowship, law degree with high honors, current federal law clerk, former National Debate Fellow. The words seemed to change the temperature of the stage. Whitmore saw her reaction. He said, "Federal law clerk is a broad phrase." Malik looked at him. "It is a precise one." Dean Shaw looked up. "Mr. Carter, you currently serve in federal chambers." "Yes," Whitmore said. "That does not make him an authority over this competition." Malik answered, "It makes me very familiar with records, standards, conflicts, and decisions that must explain themselves." Judge Park said, "That is more than relevant right now." Whitmore turned toward her. "Elena, you are letting him turn embarrassment into procedure." Judge Park's voice sharpened. "No, Graham, you turned bias into procedure when you scored him." Everything froze. Professor Lawson looked down. For the first time, the second judge, who had stayed mostly quiet, seemed to understand that silence had become a position. Dean Shaw turned to the tabulation director. "Bring the individual score sheets to the review table." Whitmore said, "Dean Shaw." She did not look at him. Now. The director hurried to the side table and returned with the sealed scoring packet. He placed it beside the laptop. Dean Shaw opened it. Judge Park's score sheet placed Malik first by a clear margin. Professor Lawson's score sheet placed the round close, but gave Malik the highest legal reasoning score. Then came Whitmore's sheet. The room could not see the numbers yet, but Dean Shaw could. Her face changed again. Malik watched carefully. Ava Brooks stood in the front row with her tablet against her chest. She knew that expression. It was the face of someone seeing in numbers what the room had already felt in sound. Dean Shaw looked at Whitmore. "Your legal reasoning score for Mr. Carter is acceptable." Whitmore said nothing. "Your evidence score is also within normal range." He lifted his chin. "But you scored him near the bottom in professional polish, institutional understanding, responsiveness, and credibility." Whitmore answered, "Those are my judgments." Judge Park said, "They are unexplained deviations from the panel." Whitmore said, "Judges are allowed to differ." Malik spoke, "They are, but when the deviation aligns with a recorded bias statement, it requires review." Dean Shaw closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened the score sheet fully and placed it under the document camera. The enlarged scores appeared on the screen above the stage. The audience reacted. Malik's scores from Whitmore were not just lower, they were surgical, low enough to pull him down, high enough in legal reasoning to avoid looking absurd, deep cuts in categories where subjectivity could hide, professional polish, credibility, institutional understanding, responsiveness. Ava whispered, "There it is." Malik heard her. He did not smile. He felt the old ache again, the ache of every comment sheet that praised substance while punishing shoes, accent, place, race, and refusal to sound grateful for being allowed inside. Whitmore said, "This is selective interpretation." Malik turned toward him. "Then explain it." Whitmore blinked. Malik continued, "What about my argument showed low institutional understanding? Your tone suggested distrust of institutions. The topic was whether public institutions should disclose decision-making when public rights are affected. You framed institutions as threats. I argued they gain legitimacy through explanation." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Malik asked, "What about my responsiveness was low?" "You did not answer directly." Judge Park said, "He answered every question I marked." Professor Lawson slowly nodded. "He did." Whitmore turned on Lawson. "Henry." Lawson looked ashamed, but he did not back down. "He answered mine too." A second crack opened. Dean Shaw saw it. The score sheet was no longer protected by the authority of 3 judges. 2 judges were separating themselves from the third. Malik looked at the screen. "And professional polish." Whitmore said nothing. "Please define it as applied to my performance." Whitmore stared at him. Malik repeated, "Please define the standard." The room waited. Whitmore had used the phrase for years. He had written it on countless sheets. He had used it to reward a familiar cadence and punish anything that sounded too urgent, too direct, too lived in, too much like someone speaking from the place law had actually harmed. But now he had to define it after the audio. He could not. Dean Shaw turned to the rule binder. Ava lifted her tablet. "Dean, the published rubric does not define professional polish beyond clarity, decorum, and effective delivery." Dean Shaw checked. "That is correct." Ava continued. "Malik was not cited for decorum. He was interrupted 12 times by Professor Whitmore and remained within time. Julian exceeded answer time in the cross-question round and rebuttal without penalty." Whitmore snapped, "You are not part of this panel." Ava looked at him. "No, I am part of the team you hoped had missing documents." The hall reacted again. Dean Shaw looked at Ava. "You have documentation." "Yes." Ava stepped toward the stage. Malik gave her a small nod. She connected her tablet to the side display. Her file opened with timestamps arranged in a clean table. Competition irregularities. 6:12 in the morning, Speaking order changed from Malik second to Malik first. No signed acknowledgement. 7:31 the previous evening. Updated rebuttal timing sheet sent to Waverly finalist folder and invited teen folders. Not sent to Carter Public Law Fellowship folder. 8:52. Judges Table Archive Audio active. 9:14. Recorded bias statement by Professor Whitmore. 9:21 through 10:27. Malik interrupted 12 times. Julian interrupted 1 time. 10:36. Julian exceeded time limit by 52 seconds. No penalty announced. 10:57. Whitmore score deviation creates outcome change. Ava voice remains steady. I also have screenshots of the distribution records and copies of the missing appendix from the public archive. Dean Shaw stared at the screen. Who had access to change the speaking order? The tabulation director said, Competition Office Administrators and Authorized Judge Liaison. Dean Shaw looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said, I asked whether the order was final. I did not change it. Ava touched the screen. The change note says, requested by Judge Liaison after morning consultation. Professor Lawson looked confused. I did not request that. Judge Park said, neither did I. All eyes moved to Whitmore. He said, I raised a concern about balance. That is not sabotage. Malik asked, what balance? Whitmore's voice lowered. The final should have a certain rhythm. Malik looked at him. You mean Julian closing? Whitmore did not answer. That was answer enough. At that moment, Dean Shaw's phone vibrated. She looked down and froze. A video call request. Judge Rebecca Monroe, National Constitutional Debate Advisory Board. Dean Shaw had forgotten that Judge Monroe was listed as an advisory reviewer for procedural disputes in the final round.
The invitation had been created months earlier for exactly this kind of issue, though no one had expected to use it in front of a live auditorium. Judge Park saw the name. Answer it. Dean Shaw hesitated. Judge Park said again, answer it. Dean Shaw accepted the call. Judge Rebecca Monroe appeared on the side screen from a quiet office lined with law books. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and a direct expression that made the auditorium sit straighter before she spoke. Dean Shaw, I received an urgent procedural alert from the archive system and Judge Park. I understand there is a scoring review? Dean Shaw's voice was careful. Yes, Judge Monroe. We have a recorded bias statement, scoring deviation, and procedural irregularities involving the final. Judge Monroe looked toward the stage. Then her eyes stopped on Malik. Mr. Carter. Malik stood straighter. Judge Monroe? A murmur moved through the room. She knew him. Whitmore's face tightened again. Judge Monroe said, for the record, Malik Carter served in my chambers as a federal law clerk. His work involved administrative records, due process analysis, and procedural review. He was one of the most careful legal writers I have supervised. The auditorium went silent. Whitmore looked as if the floor had shifted under him. The person he had called unfit for this level had been trained inside the very system that demanded reasons for decisions. Judge Monroe continued, that credential does not decide the debate, but it does confirm that Mr. Carter is more than capable of identifying a procedural defect when one appears in the record. Malik did not smile. He only said, thank you, Judge. She looked at Dean Shaw. Play the recorded statement. Dean Shaw did. Again, Whitmore's voice filled the hall. Black kids do not win debate finals at this level. Judge Monroe's face did not change. That made it worse. She asked, Professor Whitmore, is that your voice? Whitmore swallowed. It appears to be. No. Is it your voice? Yes. What did you mean? He searched for language. It was an unfortunate comment taken out of context. Judge Monroe leaned slightly toward the camera. Then give the context. Whitmore's mouth opened. Nothing came. Judge Monroe said, "I will ask differently. What competition standard permits a judge to reference a competitor race before the competitor presents an argument?" Whitmore said, "None." What standard permits a judge to predict exclusion from victory on that basis? None. What standard permits scoring categories such as polish or institutional understanding to be used as cover for that view? Whitmore whispered, "None." The room heard every word. None. 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 That was the sound of authority leaving him. Dean Shaw looked at the rule binder, then at the score sheets, then at the audience. "Professor Whitmore, you are recused from the review and suspended from further judging duties pending investigation." Whitmore stood. "This is an overreaction," Judge Monroe said. "Professor, sit down." 2 words. Everything stopped. Whitmore sat. The hall understood then that the hierarchy had changed. Whitmore had begun the morning as the man who decided who belonged at this level. Now a federal judge had told him, in front of the room, to sit down. Dean Shaw turned to the audience. "The final result is not certified. The competition will conduct an immediate review under Section 12. Julian Pierce looked at the trophy on the table beside him. His face had gone pale. Dean Shaw continued. "The review will include scoring deviation, timing irregularity, rule packet distribution, speaking order modification, recorded judge bias, and any conflict of interest or improper contact affecting the final." A reporter in the second row typed quickly. A donor whispered, "This is going to be everywhere." Dean Shaw heard it. For once, she did not respond to the public relations fear first. She looked at Malik. "Mr. Carter, do you have any additional request?" Malik stepped to the microphone. "Yes, I request that Julian Pierce be allowed to make a statement on whether he received the updated appendix and whether he observed timing or interruption differences during the round." Julian looked up quickly. Whitmore turned toward him with warning in his eyes. That look decided it. Julian stepped away from his podium and walked to the microphone. His hand brushed the trophy as he passed, but he did not pick it up. "My team received the updated appendix last night," he said. The room murmured. He continued. "I assumed everyone had it. I should have checked after I heard there was a packet issue." Whitmore closed his eyes. Julian's voice shook slightly. "I also exceeded time during my rebuttal. I saw the time light. I was not stopped. Mr. Carter was interrupted far more often than I was. I benefited from that." Dean Shaw asked, "Did Professor Whitmore discuss final structure with you or your team?" Julian hesitated. His father sat in the second row. The Waverly section watched him. Whitmore watched him. Malik watched too, but without hostility. Julian said, "Professor Whitmore told me before the final that speaking last would allow institutional arguments to settle the round properly. I did not know the order had been changed that morning. Ava wrote it down." Judge Monroe said, "That statement must be included in the review file." Julian nodded. Then he turned toward Malik. "I am sorry." Malik looked at him. "For what?" "For knowing the room was leaning my way and pretending it was just the strength of my argument." That was the first honest thing Julian had said all day. Malik answered, "Then help straighten it." Julian nodded. He picked up the trophy with both hands. For 1 second, everyone thought he was taking it. Instead, he carried it to Dean Shaw and placed it on the review table. "I do not want this certified unless the review says I earned it." The auditorium went silent again. Then a student in the back began to clap, slowly, then another, then more. Dean Shaw lifted her hand. "Please, we are still in review." The applause faded, but the meaning stayed. Whitmore stared at Julian like the young man had betrayed a family line. But Julian had not betrayed excellence. He had betrayed a lie. Judge Monroe looked at Dean Shaw. Dean, with Professor Whitmore recused, the tainted score cannot be used without independent review. You will need to determine whether the remaining valid scores, timing correction, and procedural record support a revised result or a rematch. Dean Shaw nodded. Understood. Judge Park said, I am prepared to state for the record that Mr. Carter presented the stronger legal argument and that my score reflected that. Professor Lawson looked at Malik, then at Julian. He took a breath. I am prepared to state that my scoring did not account for the interruption disparity. If time and interruption corrections are applied, my comparative assessment changes. Whitmore whispered, Coward. Lawson turned to him. No, late. That single word struck harder than a speech. Late. Not brave, not clean, but no longer silent. Dean Shaw looked at the tabulation director. Prepare recalculation excluding Professor Whitmore's score and noting procedural adjustment. The director nodded. Ava exhaled for the first time in several minutes. Noah stepped back from the review table, no longer hiding his trembling hands. Malik stood still, because the second replay of Whitmore words still lived inside him. Public vindication did not erase private injury. It only stopped the injury from being denied. Judge Monroe seemed to understand that. Mr. Carter, she said from the screen. Yes, Judge? You maintained your composure under conditions no competitor should have had to endure. Malik's throat tightened. Thank you, she continued. But composure should not be the price, continued. But composure should not be the price of being heard. The sentence moved through the hall like something sacred.
Malik looked down. His hand touched the pocket where his mother library card rested. He wished Denise Carter had heard that. Maybe, in some way, she had. Dean Shaw returned to the microphone. The review panel will take 10 minutes to recalculate and prepare a ruling on the record. Professor Whitmore will not participate. Whitmore sat motionless. For the first time all morning, nobody waited for him to speak. The room had other authorities now. The rule book, the audio, the score sheets, Ava documentation, Noah courage, Julian's statement, Judge Monroe confirmation, and Malik calm, which had never been surrender. As the review panel gathered around the table, Dean Shaw looked once at the audience and finally understood what Waverly had nearly taught the country that morning. Not constitutional excellence, not fair competition, but that prestige could cover bias until someone with a record forced it into the light. She looked at Malik again.
He stood beneath the cold stage lights, plain suit, repaired shoes, old library card in his pocket, no trophy in his hands. Not yet. But the room had changed. Professor Graham Whitmore had tried to decide who could win at this level before the debate began. Now, he no longer had a vote. And the final result was about to be rewritten by the very process he thought Malik would not know how to demand. Professor Graham Whitmore tried to decide who belonged before the debate began. Now, he no longer had a vote. For 10 minutes, Emerson Hall did not feel like an auditorium. It felt like a courtroom without a bench. The stage lights stayed cold. The brass university seal shone behind the podiums. The silver trophy sat on the review table, no longer in Julian Pierce's hands, no longer pretending the morning had been clean. Dean Eleanor Shaw stood with Judge Elena Park, Professor Henry Lawson, the tabulation director, and Judge Rebecca Monroe on video. They reviewed the score sheets again. They reviewed the timing logs. They reviewed Ava Brooks' documentation. They reviewed the speaking order change. They reviewed the missing appendix. They reviewed the audio that nobody could unhear. Malik Carter stood near the left podium with his hands at his sides. He had wanted this moment for the truth. That did not make it easy. Public vindication does not erase private injury. It only stops the injury from being denied. Ava stood beside him, her tablet pressed against her chest. She had spent the morning collecting facts because she had learned from Malik that emotion without a record can be dismissed, but a record gives emotion a place to stand. Noah Bell sat near the soundboard with his headset in his lap. His hands still trembled. He had saved the audio. He had brought it forward, and now he was realizing that courage does not always feel like courage while you are doing it. It feels like fear with no place to hide. Julian Pierce stood on the other side of the stage, away from the trophy. He looked smaller without it, but more honest. His father had not looked at him since he placed the cup on the review table. Julian noticed. He still did not pick it back up. Whitmore sat behind the judges' table, silent and rigid. For the first time all morning, no one asked for his view. No one watched his pen. No one waited for his approval. That was what accountability felt like to a man who had confused authority with ownership. Dean Shaw stepped to the microphone at 11:24. The final result has been reviewed under Section 12 of the National Constitutional Debate Final Rules. Professor Graham Whitmore's score sheet is disqualified from certification due to recorded bias, material scoring deviation, and procedural conflict. The panel has also considered the interruption disparity, timing error, missing rule appendix, and improper speaking order change. She paused. The auditorium did not move. Dean Shaw continued. After recalculation and review, the winner of the National Constitutional Debate Final is Malik Carter of the Carter Public Law Fellowship. For 1 second, there was no applause, only silence. Not disbelief, wait. Then the back rows erupted. The public school students stood first. Scholarship fellows rose beside them. Then law students, then professors, then donors who had spent the morning learning that generosity without fairness was only decoration. Ava covered her mouth. Noah lowered his head. Julian clapped, not loudly, but clearly. Malik did not move at first. His hand went to his pocket, where Denise Carter's old library card rested against his leg. He thought of his mother shelving books after closing, teaching him that the record mattered, even when the first room refused to listen. He thought of the comment sheet from his teenage debate loss. Strong content, but not the posture of a winner. He looked at the trophy, then at the room. For once, the room had to correct itself. Dean Shaw took the trophy from the review table and walked toward him. Mr. Carter. Malik stepped forward. She handed in the cup with both hands. I am sorry, she said quietly. Malik looked at her. For what? The question made her stop. She understood now that an apology without precision was only another kind of polish. She said, for allowing concern about the institution reputation to delay concern for the fairness of this final, for not intervening sooner, and for letting you carry the burden of proving what the room should have seen. Malik nodded once. That is a real beginning. Not enough. No, she accepted that. Good. Malik turned to the audience with the trophy in his hand. He did not lift it high. He did not celebrate as if the morning had been only a victory. The room had heard a judge say he could not win because he was black. The room had watched that same judge try to hide bias in score categories. The room had seen a finalist forced to request fairness in a competition about fairness. That deserved joy. But it also deserved memory. Malik stepped to the microphone. I am grateful for the review. He looked at Ava. I am grateful for the people who kept the record when silence would have been easier. Ava looked down, eyes wet. He looked toward Noah. I am grateful for the person who let the truth remain saved. Noah swallowed hard. Then Malik looked at Julian. I am grateful for the competitor who chose not to keep a result he knew had been damaged. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. Malik continued. But I do not want this final remembered only because one judge was caught. The larger question is why one judge believed he could do it. Why a missing appendix could reach one team and not another. Why a speaking order could change without signature. Why interruptions could become normal when aimed at one person. Why words like polish, maturity, and institutional understanding could carry so much power without clear definition. The hall was silent again. This was not a speech of triumph. It was a ruling in human form. Malik said, "My mother was a public school librarian. She used to say that poor children do not lack voices. They lack rooms willing to hear them." Today, this room heard me only after the record made denial impossible. The next student should not need an audio file, a federal judge, and a public review to be treated fairly. Applause came again, softer this time, deeper. Whitmore stared at the table. The camera from an academic press outlet caught that image, not because anyone planned it, because consequences sometimes arrive framed. After the ceremony, the official investigation began before anyone left the building. Dean Shaw issued an immediate statement from the stage. Professor Whitmore was suspended from all National Constitutional Debate Final activity. His prior score sheets from 6 years of finals and semifinals would be reviewed by an independent committee. The competition would audit rule packet distribution, speaking order changes, judge communications, and scoring categories. A public report would be issued within 90 days. The words "public report" mattered. Private regret had protected too much already. Judge Monroe remained on the video call long enough to speak with Malik privately from a side room after the audience began to leave. "You handled yourself with discipline," she said. Malik sat across from the laptop, finally away from the stage lights. "I did not feel disciplined." Discipline rarely feels like it from the inside. He looked down at his hands. "I kept thinking if I reacted wrong, he would use it." Judge Monroe nodded. That is the burden biased systems place on the people they harm. They demand perfect composure as the price of being believed. Malik's voice became softer. "My mother would have hated that." "She would have been right." He looked at the old library card on the table. Judge Monroe saw it. "Denise, my mother, a librarian." The judge smiled gently. Then this was her argument too. Malik nodded. "Yes." In the hallway outside, Julian waited alone with both hands in his pockets. When Malik came out, Julian stepped forward. "Malik." Malik stopped. Julian took a breath. "I am sorry for not speaking earlier. I saw the time difference. I saw the interruptions. I knew I had the updated appendix. I told myself it was not my job to question it." Malik looked at him. "And now I know silence can be an advantage someone else pays for." That answer was not perfect. It was honest. Malik said, "Then make it cost you something too." Julian nodded. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell the investigation the truth without making yourself the hero." Julian accepted that. "I will." Ava joined them, her tablet tucked under one arm. "And teach your friends that a clean win is worth more than a protected win." Julian gave a small, ashamed smile. "I deserve that." "Yes," Ava said. He nodded. "Yes, I do." 2 weeks later, the independent review opened old files. The findings were worse than Waverly hoped and exactly what Malik expected. Whitmore had a pattern. Students from public universities, historically black colleges, community colleges, and access fellowship programs received unusually low scores from him in subjective categories. Not always. He was too careful for always, but often enough. His comments rarely used open language. They used polished phrases that could pass through committees without alarm. Lacks elite composure, too personal, not nationally mature, strong passion, limited institutional fit, needs polish. Again and again, other judges scored those same students high in legal reasoning and evidence use. Whitmore pulled them down through the soft categories.
A system had let him do it because soft categories were easier to defend than direct insults. Until the microphone caught what the soft words were hiding. Professor Whitmore lost his judging appointments. Waverly removed him from the final advisory board. His visiting lecture series was canceled pending review. Several competitions reopened past appeals. 2 former finalists received corrected records. One received a retroactive shared title after the review found scoring irregularities had changed the result. Whitmore released a statement saying his words had been taken out of context. Nobody could find the context that made them fair. Dean Shaw changed too, but not quickly enough to flatter herself. The first reform meeting was uncomfortable. Students demanded independent oversight. Public program directors demanded equal access audits. Former competitors demanded to see how scoring categories had been used. Waverly tried to manage the damage. Then Malik made the terms public. No competition using the Carter Public Law Fellowship name would participate unless the following changes were adopted. Judge table audio would be archived for every final round. All rule packets would be distributed through a shared, time-stamped portal. Speaking order changes required written notice to both teams and 2 signatures. Subjective categories had to include definitions and examples. Any judge score that deviated sharply from the panel had to include written explanation. Competitors could request immediate review before certification. Judges had to disclose coaching, donor, school, or advisory relationships. Bias training became mandatory. An independent review officer had to be present at national finals. Some alumni called it excessive. Ava called it what the room had earned. Dean Shaw signed the reforms 6 weeks after the final. Not because the university enjoyed accountability, because the record left it nowhere else to stand. 3 months later, Malik used the prize money, donor commitments, and Waverly settlement funding to launch the Denise Carter Debate and Law Fellowship. The first session did not happen in an Ivy League auditorium. It happened in the library of Malik's old public high school. The paint was still peeling near the windows. The chairs still wobbled. The old heater still rattled, even though it was not winter. Malik loved all of it. On the wall behind him hung a framed copy of his mother library card, enlarged so every student could read the name, Denise Carter, public school librarian. Below it was a sentence she had once written inside Malik's notebook. A voice does not need permission to be powerful. It only needs the courage to be heard. Ava became the fellowship first director. Noah volunteered to teach a workshop on digital records and event transparency. Julian came too, not as a celebrated champion, but as a volunteer assigned to carry boxes, arrange chairs, and lead a session called What Privilege Does Not Excuse. Ava approved the title. Barely. On the first day, a student named Isaiah raised his hand. He was 15, thin, nervous, and wearing a tie that was too short. "Mr. Carter," he asked, "what if the judge already decided before you speak?" The room went quiet. Malik looked at him and saw himself at 16, wearing shoes that did not fit, reading a comment sheet that punished everything except the argument. He answered slowly, "You cannot control every judge's heart, but you can control your preparation, your evidence, your clarity, your witnesses, and your courage to ask for the rule when someone tries to hide it from you." Isaiah looked down. "What if they say I am being difficult?" Malik smiled gently. "Then ask them to write down which rule difficulty violates." The students laughed, but they understood. A girl in the second row raised her hand. "Can black kids win debate finals at that level?" The room became still. Malik looked at the framed library card, then back at her. "Yes," he said. "And not only win, you can force the room to explain why it ever doubted you." 1 year later, the National Constitutional Debate Final returned to Emerson Hall under new rules. Every finalist received the same packet through the same portal. Every scoring category had definitions. Every judge table channel was archived. The review officer sat near the timekeeper with a binder open before the first word was spoken. On the wall outside the auditorium, Waverly had installed a plaque after student pressure. Dean Shaw resisted the wording at first. Ava insisted. It read, Fairness is not proven by prestige. It is proven by process. Malik attended that final quietly from the back row. No spotlight, no announcement, no trophy display. He watched a public university student challenge a private academy champion and receive every second allowed by the rules. No interruptions disguised as standards, no missing appendix, no hidden score. At the end, the public university student lost by 2 points. She looked disappointed. Then she read the score sheets and nodded. The loss hurt, but it made sense. That was also justice. Not every fair process gives the result you want, but every fair process gives you a reason you can examine. After the event, Malik stepped outside into the cool evening air. Ava joined him on the stone steps. She asked, "Does it feel finished?" Malik looked back at Emerson Hall. "No." She smiled faintly. "I thought you would say that." He touched the library card in his pocket. Finished would mean no child ever has to prove they belong before making an argument. Then what is this? He looked through the glass doors at the stage. A door that does not close as easily as it used to. Ava nodded. That was enough for now. That morning, a year earlier, Professor Graham Whitmore thought he was only dismissing one black scholar in a room built by prestige. He thought a quiet voice meant weakness. He thought a public school background meant gratitude. He thought broad words like polish and institutional understanding could hide the old belief he had been carrying for years. He was wrong. Malik Carter did not win because he exposed a title. He won because he exposed a process. He knew the rules. He kept the record. He let the room reveal itself. And when the lie finally played through the speakers, the entire hall understood that bias often does not enter with a shout. Sometimes it arrives in a score sheet, a schedule change, a missing appendix, a soft category, a polite interruption, and a judge who thinks nobody important is listening. But someone was listening. Ava was listening. Noah was listening. Judge Park was listening. Julian, late but finally honest, was listening. And Malik Carter, with his mother library card in his pocket, was listening most of all. So if this story made you think of a student who was told they lacked polish when what they really lacked was protection, share it. If you believe every young voice deserves the same rules before the first word is spoken, say so in the comments. And if you want more stories where quiet courage, sharp evidence, and one person refusing to look away force a powerful room to tell the truth, subscribe and stay close. Because somewhere, another child is stepping to a podium in shoes the room has already judged. And somewhere, a record is waiting to prove that the voice they underestimated was never the one on trial. The room was.